Hello everyone, welcome to the Open Data track of this inaugural State of Open conference. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this room. It's a much bigger room than I thought it was going to be, but if everybody comes closer to the front then we can enter into a great conversation, I hope, as time goes on. So I'm your host for the next couple of days. As I say, it is the inaugural conference. I'd like to thank the AV team at the back who've helped us to get everything set up, and also Kristen Hadland, who's our producer in this room. And also importantly, Sonia Cooper, who isn't here yet. She's our CFP chair and helped the rest of the committee to judge the amazing entries that we had for this track. So just to give them a name check, that CFP committee were Volker Buscher, Wenhua Lee, Alex Butler, Louise Burke, Rob Bryan, Jennifer Punier, Ian Watt and Paul Clark. So thanks to all of those people. And we did have an amazing set of entries from people and groups wanting to present in this room over the next couple of days. So I hope we've got something for everyone. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. I'm going to be doing my very best to keep the sessions running to time. This is not my strong suit. Those who know me know that talking is one of my key skills. So I'm not a very good timekeeper. So you are allowed to heckle if things overrun too much. Kristen is actually going to help by holding up some very high-tech signs to keep us all to time. Now, the sessions themselves are quite short, and we've got so many interesting speakers to hear from. But we do also hope that we'll have time at least for some questions. So I'm going to do my best to leave a little bit of time at the end of each session for that. So if you don't get to ask a question, you've got a burning issue that you would like to share or something that you'd like to ask one of our panelists or talkers, then please do seek them out in the breaks. Everybody's very friendly, so I'm sure people would be really happy to be approached. So without further ado, let's get started. And this is where I do the walking and talking thing. And I hope that the team at the back can still hear me on the microphone. So I'm going to check now that you're all here for the right session. Okay, so it's called Power and Diplomacy When Open Data and Realpolitik Collide. If that's not what you were hoping to hear, the doors are about to be locked, so I suggest that you leave now. Otherwise, you have to stay. So I'm really delighted to welcome two fantastic speakers for this session. So we've got Gavin Freeguard, who is the interim head of public policy at the ODI, the Open Data Institute, so obviously the same organisation that I'm from. And we also have Putz, the policy and advocacy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation. Thanks for joining us. Okay. So one of the things that struck, we had a long chat last week, the three of us, and we decided that there was a huge amount of scope for what we could discuss in what is quite a short session of 25 minutes. And then it struck me that we've probably got people in the room who may not have thought a huge amount about data as a political instrument or a political material, let alone the weaponisation of data. And so I thought we would start from quite a basic point, which is to say, what has data got to do with politics? What has data got to do with diplomacy? What has data got to do with war? I'm going to come to you first, Gavin, with that very easy question. I think you'll agree.
Thanks, Emma. I had a horrible feeling you were about to do that. So what does data have to do with diplomacy and power and politics and everything else? Well, I suppose most things in life are political, and I think those of us who've been attached to the open data movement for a while hope that by publishing lots of data, we can open up the access to that, we can democratise the access to data and the way it's used. More than a decade on, I think we can also see where some of the politics and some of the power is coming into it. There are multiple ways in which that's happening. First of all, there are big, powerful organisations, whether they're governments or whether they're private companies, who just have more resources to be able to analyse that data, have other data that they can bring to bear on it. They're able to get much more out of it, just because they are powerful, and therefore this is just another way in which they can exert that power. We can see that, I think one of the trends that we'll see in the UK, I think, over the next year or so is that we'll start to see some political differences on how government and the public sector should approach data, and therefore how the private sector can use data as well. I think as we head towards a general election, the Conservatives on the one side and Labour on the other will start to bring different principles about how data should be used. I think you might see sort of innovation and growth being dominant on one side and perhaps thinking about more communitarian principles on the other. I realise I'm talking about domestic politics quite a lot at the moment, so let's try and take it up to the international level. We've already seen some geopolitical discussions over data. So I think as countries fall out in an international data ecosystem, you start to see political moves being made as well. There's an example of the UK Biobank, which makes its data available to researchers around the world. As UK and Chinese relations started to deteriorate a little bit, and particularly given that the UK and elsewhere wasn't able to get the data it needed from China about the COVID outbreak, we've started to see some of those access rights sort of changing. So again, there's a way that you can exert your sort of geopolitical power through that. We're starting to see people talking about regulatory diplomacy. The UK's foreign policy does exactly that, which is trying to use international institutions, international standards, being there in the room to set particular rules as an extension of power, and trying to sort of use that type of, I suppose, new diplomacy in some respects to get their way within international institutions as well.
Quite a web of relationships and different applications when you look at it from that point of view. Indeed,
and one phrase that so the ODI at the moment is doing a project around power and diplomacy and data, and one of the phrases that we've come up against is weaponised interdependency, which sounds horribly complicated, but it's sort of that. It's about thinking that the international community has lots of institutions that make countries dependent on one another to a certain extent. And are you able to exert your power within those systems? And again, access to data, the way you think about standards, the way you set standards can be part of that.
Mm-hmm. This notion of, I'm going to come to you, Ziski, because I wonder if this notion of weaponising data is something that you think about, something that you can relate to, that you recognise in your particular work. It might be useful as well for you to just describe a little bit about what your organisation does, what your role is.
Sure, so I work for the Wikimedia Foundation. It is the big international nonprofit that sits behind a lot of the open wiki projects that you might know. Wikipedia is just one of many. We also have Wikidata, which is an open store of openly accessible data. We also have Wikicommons, which is more of like a multimedia repository, especially for freely licensed images. That's sort of what comprises the bulk of it. But in terms of your question, I think in terms of answering why data or how data becomes political, I think of it in much simpler terms. I think Gavin has really done a great job of sketching out both the detail, what it looks like at the national level and also internationally in terms of how it gets caught up in these webs of geopolitics. But I would just say that data is another word for information. Some people might fight me on that. Mm-hmm. That is definitely oversimplified, but at the end of the day, it's just another means of gathering information, of communicating information, of processing it. And information is power. And especially when you have information that is made freely available, that means it's freely available to anybody, both good and bad actors. And on projects like Wikipedia, we see that go both ways. We see how open source platforms and stores of information can almost be a platform for world building, for folks to have their voices heard who previously maybe have not, because we're all caught up in these historical legacies of power, privilege, access, and exclusion. But we also see how states and big tech and other powerful actors can exploit this information store that has already been made freely available and use it to their own advantages, precisely because, as Gavin said, they have the resources to make that happen. They have the money, they have the technical capacity, and they also have the computational power.
I really love that expression, world building, like the role of data, particularly openness and open data in world building. And I guess if you were to go back 10 or 12 years, back to the days when the ODI was founded, that was exactly, we kind of, maybe in hindsight, was slightly naively saw open data and the open data movement almost in exclusively positive terms. And I wonder, what would, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but I wonder, Gavin, like reflecting on those early days, what did we get wrong, or what could we have done differently, as I say, with the benefit of hindsight, to ensure that we were able to build a world that was much more in line with our vision, much more utopian, I guess?
I think in some respects it was the sort of spreadsheet field of dreams. We thought if we built those open data platforms, everyone would come and they would have equal access to all of that, and they'd be able to make equal use of that data. And I think that didn't happen. Large institutions, for good, as well as sometimes not for quite so good, were able to bring the expertise that they had, the computing power that they had, the knowledge that they had, to be able to do more with it. And we didn't necessarily think about, well, how do we help everybody else navigate this sort of new world where there's a lot more data available? So I think that was probably part of it. I think the open data movement has changed quite a lot over the last decade, and I think publishing with purpose and phrases like that, where we understand that governments and other organisations don't have the capacity to just publish everything and put it out there, although there are some great attempts to try and do more of that. Mm-hmm. And I think we've probably become a little bit more focused on, well, why are we doing this? And those are quite healthy dynamics as well. But I think we didn't really pay as much attention as we should have to the whole ecosystem. And also, and this also goes to a sort of small p political point as well, it's really important that we have brilliant conferences like this that bring those of us who care about open data and the open movement together. But when we're talking to members of the public, we still sometimes fail to help them understand, well, why should they care about any of this? Mm-hmm. And again, I think a trend we're probably seeing at the moment is people starting to talk much more about, well, this is where open data is useful for health, or this is where open data is useful for education, or for the future of work. Mm-hmm. So again, I think we're doing things about it, mm-hmm. And we're sort of correcting some of the, not mistakes so much as the enthusiasm with which we had at the beginning led us to just want to get everything out there, mm-hmm. and now we're starting to see everything mature.
Mm-hmm. Can I interject and be cheeky? Of course. You said something along the lines of, we are failing to communicate with the public about what the open movement is. But isn't that exactly the point of the open movement, that it is for and by the public?
I suppose what I mean is, because that's absolutely right, it's if you're thinking about somebody who's never thought about data in their everyday lives, just going about their business, and they've maybe heard open data, maybe they've not heard of open data. How do we, as a movement, which again is public, but how do we talk to them about this is why you should think about this, maybe care about this, and understand why it might be a benefit to you? And
engage communities and individuals in this. I mean, we've at the ODI, we've started to work a lot more in the domain of participatory data. And, I often think we are very sort of global north centric, and we're very, sort of classist, I guess you could say. The open movement, not exclusively, but has tended to be the preserve of the elite, and those of us who are really lucky to be a part of the kind of thought leadership around this. But actually, a lot of the data that is being collected and a lot of the data that's been made available as open data is about people who have no agency in the collection, the use, and the sharing of that data. And I don't think we can have a conversation about the role of data and open data in geopolitics or diplomacy or any of these areas without touching on that subject. So I wonder, Zizki, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What are your thoughts on that, and how we operate much more as a global community rather than, because it does feel very, very sort of centred in the West currently?
I mean, my overarching response to that is just that I agree. I think you hit the nail on the head and you articulated it beautifully. Those are exactly the challenges that the open movement faces, because there's no one way in which the open movement has failed or has fallen short. It's very simply the fact that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so the ideas that we're talking about, the ideals, the people, the communities, and also the technologies that we're talking about that make up this entire movement, they are part and parcel of the political, the social, the economic forces that we interact with on a daily basis. And as you said, that influences the actual infrastructure that was designed, deployed, and governed by individuals. And as a result, it's going to reflect their biases, their assumptions, and also their objectives and interests. But then if I want to interact with that infrastructure, let's say it's access to information on a site like Wikipedia, for me, that's also going to be affected by the forces that shape my life right now. If I'm trying to access information, it's going to be something like maybe governmental censorship, corporate tracking and surveillance, somebody taking and selling my data, all kinds of situations like that. But I at least come at it from a position of privilege because I've grown up with a lot of sensitivity to media literacy. I've had the privilege of growing up with laptops in my education system. And so I'm aware of this, and I'm also guarded by it because I exist in a regulatory system. I'm Austrian, so when I'm in Austria, I get to benefit from something called GDPR, which blocks who can actually take my data. And these privileges don't exist for everybody around the world. On Wiki, we see a lot of initiatives right now to digitize cultural heritage. We think is kind of two-pronged because on one end, it's an incredible collection of projects that mean, like, there's this project, I'm trying to think of exactly what it is. They're Balinese manuscripts that are documented on palm leaves. And there's a project by Balinese Wikimedians who are trying to digitize that information, which is amazing because it means it can start to be used in classrooms. Folks all around the world can learn about this history that previously was excluded or just undocumented online, which basically means it doesn't exist until somebody else shows up in Bali and decides that they've discovered it. You know, these are dynamics that we're very familiar with. It's great when those communities are in charge, but that's not always the case, as you said. And that's where we start to lean towards situations of exploitation, or even data colonialism is a term a lot of folks use to describe what ends up happening. I kind of went on a rant there, so I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts as well on this, Gavin.
I mean, well, all of that, basically. I think, and you hinted at this, well, you more than hinted at this as well. I think there's also that change that we've got. You know, states in different parts of the world obviously have a huge amount of power in these ecosystems, and we're starting to see quite different approaches from different regions about how they approach data. So, you know, broadly speaking, the EU, you mentioned GDPR, has a more citizen-centric view of how some data is used than some others. So, for instance, the US, it's probably more market-based. In China, it's a lot more sort of state surveillance-based to the way that they approach data. And we're starting to see, we've got this with the online safety bill here in the UK at the moment, that different parts of the world are starting to think about internet regulation in different ways. So those values that governments are bringing are going to start changing some of these things. But the other thing that you sort of mentioned was, I suppose, that privatisation, actually, of some of that quite important infrastructure. We think about the big tech companies. It's not just the big tech companies. There are lots of others. But if you think about some of those and the power they have over the physical infrastructure as well behind a lot of this, so, you know, ownership of undersea cables, data centres. I think it's Castells, the sort of media theorist, who sort of says the paradox is that as our world becomes more wireless, we become more and more dependent on that physical infrastructure. So who owns that, who regulates that, who governs that really matters.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting point, the relationship between states, big tech, the physical infrastructure, as you mentioned. There are those who suggest that, you know, the big tech companies now operate much more like nation states than they do like private enterprises. And, you know, there are also those who say that as a result of that, they should be governed by the same sorts of instruments as government, so that, you know, they not that they should have elected officials, but that they should have more of the kind of checks and balances around them than normal kind of enterprises would have. A few less of the freedoms and more of the responsibilities that go with collecting these vast amounts of data that they do. I just wonder what your thoughts are around that in particular, and actually whether it's workable even, because, you know, as you mentioned, Gavin, it depends on where you are, doesn't it, as to how people see the relationship between the state and the big tech companies. And, you know, I mean, the TikTok in the news today, I'm trying very hard not to mention that and the balloon. But yeah, Ziska, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on the kind of regulation and the sort of infrastructure that should be placed around big tech.
I have a lot of feelings about this. I could go on another rant, I think, about accountability, because that's what it comes down to me. I don't know what the tools are or the mechanisms to make that happen, if national policy is actually the tool that you should be applying to hold big tech to account. But I also sort of take issue with these conversations that only orient around big tech. Of course, it's a massive power, and they are shaping the infrastructure that they use, and they are also increasingly shaping the norms and the regulations that determine how I get to interact with information online. But just because they're big powers and big bullies doesn't mean that they're the only ones we should be listening to. And Gavin mentioned the UK Online Safety Bill. I think this is exactly an example of what can go wrong, maybe. The UK Online Safety Bill right now is trying to hold big tech to account for harmful content that they may host on their platforms. That is objectively a good thing to try to do, except when you design a regulation with the idea that big tech equals the entire internet, platforms like Wikimedia fall to the side. And certain aspects of this regulation would be detrimental to the way that free and open knowledge projects like Wikipedia actually exist. For example, there would be some stringent top-down content moderation policies that sort of require a centralized actor. And that is the exact opposite to how Wikipedia has been running as a very successful and trustworthy source of information for the past 20 plus years. It's community-led content moderation. And that's something that I think speaks to that early utopian ideal of the internet, that this kind of collective action and democratic participation can actually work to govern content online and to create something that, at the end of the day, is a public good for information. It's not information that's behind paywalls. And if we only stick to regulations like the UK Online Safety Bill, which also is going to be one of the first actors, so it could easily have a ripple effect in terms of influencing public policies in other countries around the world, what's going to happen to the rest of the internet? The sites that aren't big tech, that we get a lot of joy from. Maybe those are just meme generators, but that's a lot of fun.
It's interesting. I mean, Jimmy Wales is he's speaking tomorrow in the plenary session, giving a keynote, but he's also back here tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock.
And so ask him all the
We'll
hard
be
questions.
asking him about the online safety bill. So if you're interested in that, then that's the opportunity, but lots of other things as well. Gavin, I'm going to come to you for a response to that provocation, but then I think we'll have 5 minutes of questions and thoughts from the audience before we close.
Great. Well, I think in a sense, something like the online safety bill, whichever new government department is responsible for it by the end of this event, sort of shows both the good and the bad of politics and the role it has to play. It can be good in that, again, done right, which it hasn't necessarily been. You might have a political vision for how you might constrain some of the power of certain actors in the system, and it is good that there is democratic discussion about that, and that is something that can solve some of the problems that we've touched about. On the other hand, it also shows the bad, which you've already gone into, but and I suppose just one final point on the good is that there is that sense still sometimes of tech inevitability and tech solutionism, that it will solve all of our problems, it will naturally evolve in such a way, but actually there are political choices around that can make it work for us in a better or worse way. Where it shows the sort of bad of politics is that I suppose it's open to a lot of the problems that we already see in political systems. Certain actors can lobby much more strongly than others, certain voices will be heard much more loudly, and the sort of sausage-making, compromising, bartering of legislation means that some things don't always cohere the way they should, and you can end up with legislation which is patchy and not really that well thought through. And I think we have a particular issue when it comes to digital policy, data policy, tech policy, cyber policy, whichever of the different names you want to give it, that our politicians still haven't quite got there in terms of understanding how best to do all of this, the things they need to think about, and not necessarily having the support structures in place to support them with that as well.
And there's a big skills and knowledge piece there as well, but we haven't got time to go into that one just now. So I'd like to ask if anyone from the audience has a question or a thought or a provocation, or lady over here. Could you wait for the microphone? I think we've got some microphones, handhelds. I was given really strict instructions not to let anybody ask a question until they had a microphone. Here you go.
Thank you. Hello? No.
Oh dear. There's another one coming, I think.
We have another question in the front.
Yeah, we can't take questions without a microphone because of our colleagues that have joined us online.
Does that work?
There we go, that's
okay,
working.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm Alex. You spoke about how open data movement is biased towards like the global north. However, sort of global data collection can benefit things like scientific research because you're not just taking sort of information from subjects who are geographically close to research institutions but worldwide. And you can implement things like data trust and things like this to sort of shift the power away from these large institutions to a more distributed power balance of, you know, who controls data. How realistic do you think these sorts of structures are going forward? Do you think sort of the data paradigm will shift towards this more like decentralized control of data?
Thank you, great question. Zisky, I'm going to come to you first for that one.
Is this a question mainly about like how I feel about it, if I think it's going to happen? I am actually very optimistic about this. I think like the powers that be have way more control and power than the smaller actors who are trying to counteract and sort of make this decentralized control possible. But I'm very optimistic because we're seeing a lot more of these kinds of initiatives cropping up. We're seeing a lot of countries in the global south starting to rally around copyright reform that would actually allow them to have some protections in the digital age and to make sure that when they're partnering with a research center around global health initiatives in the UK, and let's say between the UK and Kenya, that then when that paper, that data set is released, they will continue to have access to it and they will be credited with it. And it's not just put up behind paywalls. You also have initiatives from Tim Berners-Lee and Nigel Shadbolt who are trying to figure out what decentralized data architectures could actually look like online and to make sure that there are data collectives where individuals have agency and control. So I think the fact that these conversations are starting to happen and also that they're much more representative and diverse in terms of who is participating in them and whose interests are part of them are really, really important and really encouraging. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Great. I'm going to take one question from this person over here, if that's okay, and this will need to be the last one. I'm so sorry, we're just on such a... No, you can ask your question. This is the last question.
Hello? Yeah.
There you go.
So I was wondering if you have some thoughts on best strategies to achieve effective public engagement for responsible governance of data, but also other technologies such as AI. Thank you.
Gavin.
Well, the ODI is currently doing some work on participatory data governance, which is helpful. And I think this is one of those conversations that's really starting to kick into gear at the moment, and people are asking that question. So we have got some examples in the UK, I think, of people, sort of using things like citizens' assemblies, more deliberative methods, as well as more quantitative things like public attitudes tracking, which helps and is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We do need to go to that next level of sort of bringing people in. I think we've seen some failures of that recently, things like GPDPR, which was the attempt to use more health data, didn't really talk to the public as much as it should have. So in fact, I suppose we've got negative examples of how not to do it at the moment. But places like the ODI, the Ada Lovelace Institute as well, have got research which is pointing towards people who've done this well. I think it's about, and we see academic organisations do exactly the same thing as well, it's about ensuring that there is that space for people to be able to get involved at all stages of a data sharing, data use process. So all the way from the design, all the way through to monitoring the implementation and just making sure that that voice is built in and making sure that those voices are built in, because of course the public does not have a single view on how their data is used. It's important to try and get that diversity and understand the different perspectives.
And I think that's a really positive note to end on. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank Zisky and Gavin for being on the panel. The next panel, if you want to stick with open data, and I really hope you do, is General Best Practices in Open Data, which is being chaired by Salona Bonewald from IEEE. So we're going to take 5 minutes just to reorient the room, and then we'll be kicking off that panel very soon. Thank you.